Welcome to another Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex global stories, really give you that shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, our journey takes us to Malawi, often called the warm heart of Africa.
Hey.
We're going to explore its rich history, from ancient roots right through to its vibrant culture, and trace its long quest for development and democracy. So yeah, get ready for a fascinating deep dive into a truly unique nation.
Absolutely. And what really strikes you about Malawi's story is how deeply it's woven into its geography. I mean, it's a landlocked nation, Southeast Africa. You've got Mozambique, Zambia, Tanzania all around it. But so much of its identity, its very heartbeat, it revolves around this huge body of water, Lake Malawi.
Right. And when you say huge, immense,
Yeah.
you really mean it, don't you? Just how big are we talking, and why is it so absolutely central to Malawi? For survival, even.
Oh, it's colossal. It stretches nearly 600 kilometers long. And the area it covers, well, it's almost the size of Belgium. So that makes it the third largest lake in Africa, both by surface area and volume. But look, its size isn't just a statistic, it's a lifeline. This vital natural resource, it provides fresh water, protein, and a livelihood for, well, estimates say around 40% of Malawi's population.
40%. That sounds absolutely essential.
Mhm.
Are there specific things about its ecosystem that really stand out?
Definitely. The biodiversity is just astounding. It's home to roughly 180 endemic fish species, meaning found nowhere else. And get this, 90% of those are cichlids, those diverse, often brightly colored freshwater fish. There's even a unique fish, the chilunguni, only in Lake Malawi, though tragically it's now threatened by overexploitation.
That's worrying.
It is, and it highlights this critical paradox. Despite the lake's bounty, despite fish being crucial for food security, about 15% of the fish actually eaten in Malawi is imported, and this influx of, cold storage fish has unfortunately really undermined the traditional ways of processing fish. This hits women particularly hard, impacting their livelihoods, their economic independence.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really stark example of how even these vital local resources can get compromised by, global market forces.
It's sobering, isn't it? How external factors can affect something so fundamental locally. Okay, so to really get the nation's journey, we need to step back, way back, to its pre-colonial roots. Who were the very first people living there?
Well, the earliest evidence points to nomadic hunter-gatherer groups, often called pygmy or bushman tribes, also known as the Batwa. They lived in caves, it seems, often looking for refuge from, tribal conflicts.
So nomadic life, really shaped by finding safety, finding resources. What happened next? How did things evolve?
A really significant turning point comes around 2,000 years ago. That's when Bantu-speaking ancestors arrived. They migrated down from East Africa. Seems they followed the Great Rift Valley, always searching for, fertile land, good hunting grounds.
And these Bantu-speaking groups, they brought major changes, didn't they? Really transformed the region.
Precisely. They introduced agriculture, animal husbandry. They knew ironworking, masonry, too. You can actually still see remnants today. Old stone mounds, these kind of curious underground tunnels. Their social structures were also distinct, often matrilineal, tracing descent through the mother's line.
Interesting. So as these groups settled, they started to, define themselves more clearly. Territories, chiefdoms, what kind of political structures started emerging?
Yeah, you start seeing the formation of more elaborate hierarchical states, monarchies basically, led by paramount leaders. A good example is Chief Chiklimayembe of the Tumbuka people up in the northern region. In that system, land was owned collectively by the state.
Okay, so centralized power in some cases.
Right, but it wasn't uniform. You contrast that with groups who arrived later, like the Lomwe. They tended to form looser coalitions, more like independent headmen advised by Nduna wise men. So a much more decentralized kind of authority there. It suggests, quite a varied political landscape before Europeans showed up.
A real mix then. Centralized, decentralized, probably shifting over time. And I guess tribal conflicts must have played a big part in shaping all this.
Oh, absolutely. Invasions by groups like the Ngoni and the Yao, the records speak of a wake of destruction. Sometimes smaller tribes were just absorbed, assimilated into the larger, more powerful ones. But even with that conflict, you saw powerful pre-colonial states rising. Think Mankamba, North Dakota, Chulo. And the Roswy Empire, particularly, expanded massively. It was seen as the sort of divine kingship. The king was the highest priest, the national protector, a really powerful symbol of a chief's authority back then, the drum.
The drum, right? So from these established societies, we jump forward quite a bit to the mid-19th century. A completely new, disruptive era begins with Europeans arriving, explorers, traders, missionaries. What were they after initially?
Well, at first the main draws were ivory and, unfortunately, the slave trade. But once the slave trade was abolished, their commercial focus shifted. They started looking for rubber, gold, agricultural products like coffee and cotton, and that fundamentally started changing the local economies.
And this is where David Livingstone comes in, the famous Scottish explorer. He crosses Lake Nyasa in 1859. What was driving him?
Livingstone was, well, largely driven by this desire to open up what he called the Dark Continent. His aims were framed as bringing civilization, commerce, and Christianity. His journeys definitely put the region, including what's now Malawi, on the map for European powers.
And that mapping quickly led to the infamous Scramble for Africa, right, where European powers just carved up the continent at the Berlin Conference. How did that play out for Nyasaland as it came to be known?
Yeah, the competing claims over Nyasaland really heated up. In the end, the British secured control. They established the Nyasaland Protectorate in 1907. It's interesting looking at those early interactions. There's a story of the Manganja chief, Bandula, being persuaded by a trader to, secure his people's rights. And apparently some locals initially thought the Portuguese were great spirits. Just shows the cultural clash, the power imbalances right from the start.
So the British Central Africa Protectorate, set up in 1891, eventually becomes Nyasaland. It covered parts of modern Malawi, Zambia, Tanzania. What was the initial British policy?
Well, initially the British were actually a bit reluctant to just hand control over to charter companies like they did elsewhere. They preferred direct crown colony status. And their initial idea, supposedly, was for Nyasaland to be a land of natives rather than focusing on big plantations.
But that initial idea didn't last long, did it?
Yeah.
What was the real impact on the Malawian communities when the British took control?
Oh, the impact was devastating, truly. Indigenous peoples were basically forced off their fertile ancestral lands, pushed into areas that were much less productive. Meanwhile, white settlers, especially from South Africa and southern Rhodesia, they were actively encouraged to come in and take the best land.
So straight-up economic exploitation, then?
Absolutely. Locals were forced into growing cash crops, cotton, tobacco, mainly to generate revenue for the colonial administration, not for their own benefit. And roads were built, yes, but not really for local development. They were built to make it easier to export cheap labor out to mines in neighboring territories. It completely restructured their economy, their daily lives.
That paints a very clear picture of systematic exploitation.
Yeah.
How did Malawians react? Was there resistance early on?
There definitely were early educated leaders who started advocating for the people, but the colonial authorities, well, they largely suppressed these voices. They used various laws and acts that effectively put the state above the law. It was a clear strategy to crush any organized dissent before it could really take root.
Okay, that brings us to a major turning point you mentioned. 1944, the British actually sanctioned the formation of political parties. And that led to the Nyasaland African Congress, the NAC.
Yes, and within the NAC, you quickly saw two main factions emerge. There was the accommodationist faction. This included BM Kamuzu Banda, who we'll talk more about, and other Western-educated figures. And then there was the militant faction, mostly workers pushing for more radical change. Ultimately, it was Banda's philosophy that won out. He became the dominant force. And this whole period, the 40s and 50s, especially after World War II, you see African nationalism really picking up steam, growing into mass movements, nationwide upheavals.
And right at the heart of this rising nationalism was Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda. Tell us about him. Who was he? How did he end up in this key role?
Right, Banda. Born 1896 in Goliati. He trained as a doctor, studied in the U.S. and Britain. Interestingly, the sources suggest he initially held, well, contempt for his own countrymen, viewed them as backward and superstitious. But he was also shrewd. He realized nationalism could be his path to power, to influence.
That's quite a starting point for a nationalist leader. So how did he actually get back into Malawian politics to lead the movement?
Well, his return in 1958 was apparently on the advice of Ghana's president at the time, Nkrumah. And Banda played it strategically. He used moderate language, carefully sidestepped tricky issues. This made him seem like a safe pair of hands to the white capitalist nations. They saw him as their darling, someone they could work with.
A cautious strategy, but clearly effective. Nyasaland moved towards self-government in 1961, and then the big day. July 6, 1964, Malawi gains independence, becomes a republic a month later. But what was the hidden cost of this victory?
Yeah, independence was achieved, but it came with significant political repression. Even during the struggle, thousands of Malawians who were just suspected of disloyalty were detained without trial. Many faced torture. Dissidents were executed, and this was all backed up by a really elaborate system of informers. It paints a pretty grim picture alongside the fight for freedom.
So independence arrives. There must have been this huge wave of optimism, hope for a better future after colonialism.
Oh, absolutely. A real hope for a better political, social future after all those years of colonial rule and racial prejudice. But the complexities hit immediately. It was incredibly hard to just shake off that deep colonial bitterness. And then there was Malawi's complicated ethnic mosaic, as the sources call it. You had Chewa, Tumbuka, Ngoni, Yao, Lomwe, and others. This immediately created suspicion, difficult questions about, who should lead, how power should be shared.
Right, and one of the first big moves was becoming a republic. Banda deliberately downplayed the traditional chiefs and kings.
He did. He wanted to centralize power around the new state structure. Though for a while, in some provinces, you actually had both a traditional king and the president ruling side by side, a transitional phase.
And Banda himself, he didn't waste any time consolidating his own power, did he? Wins the '64 election, becomes prime minister, then head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief. His party, the MCP, took every single seat.
Exactly. He moved incredibly fast. He put a stop to constitutional reform, prevented any real scrutiny from the assembly. By June '66, he'd tightened his grip even further, diminishing Parliament's role. And crucially, things like fundamental freedoms, human rights, they just weren't guaranteed. This paved the way for the destruction of opponents campaign that kicked off in the late '60s.
Tell me more about that campaign, establishing a one-party state.
Yes. It meant mass imprisonments, interrogations. Any political activity that wasn't sanctioned by his party, by the state, was simply labeled abominable. It effectively crushed all dissent.
It sounds like a calculated reign of terror, silencing the press, hunting down opponents, beatings, assassinations. You mentioned Mutul, imprisoned for life. Yet somehow the West seemed to accept Banda, calling him a model dictator. How does that work?
It's a really complex and frankly disturbing paradox. The West, particularly certain powerful capitalist nations, saw Banda as, well, that safe pair of hands again, someone who'd maintain stability, order, even if it meant sacrificing democratic freedoms. His strong anti-communist stance during the Cold War helped. His willingness to engage with Western economic interests made him an acceptable, albeit authoritarian, partner for them. So yeah, despite the brutal repression happening inside Malawi, his regime was largely tolerated, even supported by many international players. It wasn't really until the late 1980s that his iron grip finally started showing some cracks.
And while all this political drama unfolded, what was happening with the economy? What were the underlying realities for ordinary Malawians?
Well, since independence, Malawi's economy has really been grappling with these deep-seated challenges: structural, behavioral, contingent, all sorts of macroeconomic problems. It's classified as a low-income country. GDP per capita, just under $860. That number alone highlights the persistent widespread poverty.
So deep poverty is just fundamental. Is it mostly a rural issue? And what are the main drivers?
Yes, it's overwhelmingly rural. And it's often driven by these recurring crises in farming. And this poverty has persisted despite decades of development aid coming in. You see these clear structural imbalances. The economy relies way too heavily on just one or two agricultural commodities for export. Growth in other areas, like horticulture, is really slow. And trying to build up manufactured exports is tough because transport costs are high, labor costs are high relative to productivity. It's this sort of vicious cycle of limited economic diversification.
And what's concerning is hearing that any growth that did happen was often funded temporarily by foreign investment linked to fiscal laxity, basically.
Yeah.
Loose government spending and flight capital, money just leaving the country quickly, not really building a sustainable foundation.
Exactly. It points to this recurring challenge with governance, with long-term planning, a theme that keeps coming up.
Okay, so this tight grip, the economic struggles, eventually something had to give. In 1992, religious groups formed a coalition, the Public Affairs Committee, and they actually managed to push the government into holding a referendum.
That's right, a major push. And on June 14th, 1993, the Malawian people delivered a decisive verdict. An overwhelming majority, 74%, voted for a multi-party system. They rejected the one-party draft constitution. This forced Banda's dictatorship to finally open up. The first multi-party elections followed in 1994. Banda's MCP was defeated. Dr. Bakili Maluzi and his UDF party won. A really pivotal moment for democracy in Malawi.
It sounds like it should have been, as the source puts it, a truly rosy start. And initially, in '95 maybe it was, a free press popping up, talk shows, accountability suddenly on the agenda, people feeling they could question things.
Yeah, that initial optimism was definitely there. You could feel it. But That honeymoon period didn't last very long. The unguarded tolerance of the free press, as one source calls it, quickly became an issue. Sometimes it tipped over into slander, gossip, harassment. You had incidents like Channel Africa losing its license that sent a chilling message. And the opposition parties, they struggled, often fell apart because of internal fighting, factionalism. Parliament itself became, quote, unfree. There were reports of members being blackmailed or bribed. Efforts to restrict freedom of expression, freedom of association, they didn't disappear. The old habits of control were still there.
So with these renewed pressures on basic freedoms, what about civil society groups, CSOs? Could they push back? Where did they fit in?
CSOs certainly blossomed after the 1994 Constitution guaranteed those freedoms. You saw groups focusing on youth, women, labor, churches, grassroots movements springing up everywhere. And initially, they really did boost the political conversation. But as economic crises get worse, as anger towards the government grew, these CSOs started facing more attacks from the state. They were pressured to stay politically neutral. Their leaders sometimes faced arrest. Their offices were closed down. It shows that really difficult tightrope they had to walk trying to engage civically while facing government suppression.
And this growing unhappiness, it inevitably boiled over into unrest, didn't it? Riots, demonstrations starting around 2007 suggests a pretty fragile environment for those new freedoms.
Absolutely. The Malawi presidency itself, well, it was marked by an inexperienced team, some initial institutional collapse, issues with electoral malpractice. Sources talk about a continued authoritarianism that was hard to challenge effectively. But then a new opposition emerged, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. Under Bingu wa Mutharika, he eventually won a significant election and pursued what was seen as a comparatively popular government agenda.
But those underlying governance problems, they didn't just vanish. Calls for reform met resistance. Now, there has been an unprecedented peaceful transfer of power between leaders in recent times, which is significant.
It is, yeah.
But the new leadership still inherited this heavily indebted economy. And the social unrest didn't stop. Grievances, protests between 1999 and 2005, sometimes turning violent. You had incidents like a journalist being shot. And President Malawi even labeling protesters as criminals. It just highlights that ongoing struggle for real stability, real democratic accountability.
And shifting gears a bit, beyond the politics and economics, there's this other vital thread defining Malawi. It's really vibrant culture. How does that rich heritage shape the nation's identity, its resilience?
That's a great point. Culture is absolutely integral to Malawi's national identity, its development. It covers everything: history, language, customs, heritage.
And that includes both the tangible stuff, monuments, buildings, artifacts you can see and touch, and the intangible heritage. Things like oral traditions, art, dance, folklore, songs, poetry, proverbs. What's really compelling is that Malawi is multi-ethnic. Lots of different languages, different beliefs, but somehow these shared cultural values manage to unite the nation.
So unity despite diversity, that's powerful. How does Malawi manage preserving these traditions while dealing with, globalization, modernization?
Well, the sources suggest Malawi tries to embrace changes coming from outside globalization, urbanization, but at the same time resist things that might threaten its core moral values. It's a tricky balancing act. For example, there's apparently some prejudice against certain traditional practices, like Ngoni initiation rites or the Gole Wamkulu dance. Some critics claim they promote Satanism. And conversely, some newer Christian practices have themselves been criticized by others as being like instruments of enslavement. So it's this constant dynamic interplay between old and new, traditional and modern.
Let's talk language, always a cornerstone of identity.
Okay.
What are the official languages in Malawi?
Okay, so English is the official language for government, official business. But Chichewa is recognized as the national language. It's widely spoken, used in education, socially. And its status really underscores Malawi's Bantu identity, even within the government structures.
That's an interesting detail, cementing those cultural roots in the state itself. But I heard there's been some pushback against promoting Chichewa too widely.
That's right. Attempts to popularize it further have apparently met resistance from some areas. Business leaders, even some presidential peers, reportedly dismissed it as village talk, not suitable for formal settings or business. It just illustrates that ongoing tension, doesn't it, between embracing traditional identity and what's seen as modern necessity or prestige.
Yet despite all these internal tensions, Malawi has this wonderful reputation, the warm heart of Africa. known for its friendly, open-hearted, peaceful people. That's quite an identity.
It absolutely is a powerful reputation. And within that, the Chua people offer a really vivid glimpse into Malawi's traditions. Their identity is deeply tied to customs, observing life cycles. Elements from Lake Malawi-specific fish like the nyamazi, water lilies, crocodiles, they're profoundly linked to their ancestors, their oral history.
Yeah, you get this beautiful picture of Chua traditions. Skilled craftspeople, ritual songs, sky-gazing for meaning, a rich heritage of performance, communal bush meals, folk tales told around the fire. It all builds this incredible oral tradition.
And this deep appreciation for nature, for memory, it seems to extend across Malawi. Drinking sugarcane juice, picking wild figs, eating roasted crickets or fried fish. It speaks to this really strong connection to the land and their heritage.
Which brings us right up to the present day, and Malawi's really significant challenges, which, maybe paradoxically, also hold opportunities. The population is booming, around 16 million now. That gives it the second highest population density in Africa, after Mauritius.
And the health picture is stark. It has the highest proportion of people living with HIV on the continent. That means over 25,000 deaths every year. Malaria is endemic, life expectancy is just over 46 years, and poverty. Half to two-thirds of Malawians living on less than $1 a day, one of the world's lowest GDP per capita figures. And this is despite having access to fertile land. How can a country with that agricultural potential still face such deep poverty?
It's the critical question, isn't it? Underscores the complexity. Although there's that surprising detail in the stats. Household surveys apparently showed poverty actually declined a bit, from 65% in '93 down to 57% in '98.
Right. It suggests progress is possible, even if it's slow when efforts are focused. And the government itself, they do recognize the potential, developing their people for economic participation, leveraging those natural resources, fossil fuels, minerals, agriculture.
So what does that mean for the future? What are the key opportunities Malawi could potentially grab hold of?
Well, there are some significant prospects. Sustainable biofuels, for instance. Malawi has abundant sources: soya, palm sap, cassava, jatropha, groundnuts, sunflower. These could offer short-term solutions for power, for transport, and long-term potential as valuable cash crops. Then there's hydropower. Huge potential from the Shire River. It's fed by more than 10 lakes up in Tanzania. There are plans for high voltage lines, deeper reservoirs. There was even talk of a canal to a sort of hypothetical Malawi lake death.
Okay, those sound like genuinely incredible opportunities. But if the potential is so clear, what's been the missing piece? Why hasn't Malawi managed to translate these resources into broad prosperity yet?
And that's the candid truth, isn't it? The crucial missing link. These opportunities exist, yes, but actually leveraging them effectively, that takes more than just investment money. It demands visionary governance, as the source puts it. You need effective institutions, properly resourced, that can actually enforce the rules for the market, for the private sector. The really disheartening reality seems to be that past governments have often just hoped direct investment would magically solve development problems without putting in the hard work of building good governance, showing this unwillingness to take even the first steps towards strengthening those crucial institutional frameworks. This recurring theme of governance, or maybe the lack of it, seems absolutely central to Malawi's ongoing challenges and its ability to finally realize all that potential.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really journeyed through Malawi's incredibly complex path. From those earliest hunter-gatherers, the rise of pre-colonial kingdoms, through the deep scars of colonialism, the fight for independence, right up to this ongoing struggle for real democracy, for sustainable development. It's a powerful story of resilience, but also ongoing struggle.
It truly is a nation that's definitely endured missteps, malpractice. But the spirit of the people, that desire for democracy, for freedom of expression, it remains incredibly vibrant. You see new leaders constantly emerging from all sorts of backgrounds, capturing people's attention. It shows Malawi really is, in many ways, at the forefront of political consciousness in Africa.
So considering Malawi's unique path, from that benevolent, warm heart image to the reality of enduring socio-political turbulence, what lessons, maybe, can we draw about the resilience of a nation just striving to define its own future against these powerful tides of history of global economics? Definitely something to think about until our next deep dive.